Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the evolution of evolution. So, one of the first people that started working with the theory of evolution and with some of the principles of evolution, mechanics of it, was Jean Baptiste Lamarck. And he was the first scientist to propose a mechanism for how organisms change. And his idea was called the inheritance of acquired traits. So, what he basically gave an example of is that the giraffes originally did not have really long necks. So over time, their food source became scarce, so they needed to eat the leaves out of the trees. And so the giraffes with longer necks were the ones that survived and were able to mate and pass on the genes. And that is why the giraffes' necks have grown longer and longer, because those are the organisms that survived due to their environment. So this is basically an example of what he was saying. So the ancestors of the giraffes had short necks, but they had the habit of eating leaves up on the trees. As they reached for higher leaves, their necks became longer, and the character of long necks was passed on to their descendants, making a long necked giraffe. So his assumptions were that one, organisms have a desire to change. They have an inborn urge to do better and to better themselves in order to fit the needs of their environment. Um, so birds tried to fly and eventually grew wings because of their efforts. Second, organisms can change shape by using or not using their body parts. So this little guy doesn't have any wings. So he is just wingless. So the wings of the bird that does not fly would get smaller from generation to generation, and the wings would eventually disappear. And that's a kiwi bird, by the way. 3, organisms can pass on acquired traits to their offspring. So if an animal developed muscles from lifting weights during its lifetime, it could pass those muscles on to its offspring. The next person to work with the mechanisms of evolution was Charles Darwin. He was an English naturalist, and he traveled around the world on a ship called the Beagle. He stopped in the Galapagos Islands, and there he observed lots of different fossils, and he observed that there were these finches. And so the finches are like huge in number, and they were all different shapes and all different sizes, and their beaks were different shapes and different sizes. So they all survived well on this island because they had no competition for food sources because of their variation within their beaks. He also noticed a lot of tortoises and blue-footed boobies, and so he basically uh, brought back a lot of specimens that he examined, and then he did write the origin of species later on. So these red lines represent his travels, where he went. And here are the Galapagos Islands, which is in Ecuador. So here are some of the finches that he saw. And he decided that when he was doing his studies that all of these finches had enough characteristics that were in common that they basically came from a common ancestor. And this allowed them to have changes that allowed them not to compete necessarily for food sources, living environments, and things like that. So after his study, Darwin came up with 4 main ideas. And here's an example of his book, The Origin of Species. The first idea was individuals differ, and some of this variation can be inherited. 2, that organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Thus, they have to compete for resources, and only the most fit will survive and reproduce. Now, this is where a lot of times they'll say the survival of the fittest, but actually it's survival of the fittest for that particular environment. It doesn't mean that it's the strongest. It doesn't mean that it's the most characteristics that cause it to survive in one area may not allow it to survive in another, but it's best suited for that particular environment. 3, the most fit organisms pass on their inheritable traits to their offspring. and 4 species alive today are descendants with modifications or changes from their ancestors. So descent with modification. So descent with modification means that you have changes in organism over time, many generations. Natural selection means that you have pressure. The environment puts on a specific trait that affects their ability to survive. And then evolution means changes over time. Therefore, we now call Darwin's idea biological evolution. So Darwin was influenced by the work of other people. Thomas Mathias, which is he dealt with a lot of populations and population growths and how different environments basically allowed populations to either increase or decrease due to predator prey type scenarios. James Hutton and Charles Lyell, where he said geographical records. So, did mountains have an effect on how things changed? Did different climates have an effect on the way that things changed? And then different farmers, how their breeding processes took place. If you bred this animal with this animal, you always got the same results, or did you have different results? So, Matthias was a British clergyman and scholar, and his predictions the human population would grow faster than space and food supplies needed to sustain it, and the only checks on the human population would be war, famine, and disease. And that has been true in a lot of our history because when our populations start overgrowing, things can happen. And sometimes those things have to be corrected from a biological standpoint or environmental standpoint through war, famine, and disease. It lowers the population, which allows the people who are survived the space and the food that they need in order to keep surviving. So Darwin was influenced by Matthias because of his theory of population growth. So in nature, Darwin saw that many organisms have produced many offspring, but most of them died. So if you think about fish laying eggs, fish lays hundreds of eggs, some of them lay thousands of eggs, but they only have a few that survive. And so then those go on and they may make it to where they're adults and can reproduce. They may not, depending on the prey and predator populations and relationships. So Darwin wondered what determines which individuals survive and reproduce. So then he looked at James Hutton and Charles Lyell and their geographical uh, results. So Hutton's considered the father of modern geology, and based on the layers found in the rock structure, Lyell proposed that the Earth is millions of years old, not just hundreds or thousands. And Lyell proposed that geographical features could be built up or torn down over long periods of time. After reading Lyell's book, Darwin was convinced that the Earth was really old, and he found that it could change. When the Earth changed, then life on Earth could change as well. And if it didn't change, then you would probably have um, death to that particular species. Farmers recognize that within a population there is natural variation. So if you sort of look at the two cows, there's nothing wrong with either of those cows. They just have a different coloration. They have a different pattern in their coat and their fur coloring. So farmers improve their plants and animals through selective breeding. So farmers bred the plants or animals with the most desired traits. This process of humans allowing only the best organisms to reproduce is called artificial selection. And dogs are one of the best things to look at this with because there are so many different kinds. So 10,000 years of evolution by artificial selection has produced all of these different variations within a dog. All of these dogs originated from a wolf. That was their common ancestor. But because of selective breeding or breeding to best fit their environment in order for them to survive, you have the hundreds of dogs that variations that you have today.